The phrase, the theater of the mind, is sort of an old moniker for radio. And what it implies is that in radio, you use your imagination more than in other forms of art because radio is a blind medium. We don't see what's happening, we hear it. And while this is true to some extent, I think that really any art can be a theater of the mind. It really depends on the artist and the audience. But some radio drama, especially the ones we're going to be listening to over the next 4 weeks, are really exemplary in the way they engage and still engage the imaginations of their listeners. And I think that in sort of today's extraordinary situation with COVID-19, the ways in which these radio shows engage our imagination seem particularly relevant. You know, I'm offering this class on radio and especially tonight's class on War of the Worlds because on the one hand, we're experiencing a lot of similar crises that were being experienced in the 1930s and 40s during the so-called golden age of radio. Times of panic, high anxiety, where we hear that institutions like government, the media, and universities, along with their representatives, politicians, reporters, scientists, professors, are on the one hand to be trusted and revered, on the other hand to be mistrusted and denigrated. A big government versus small government, a trustworthy press versus a scaremongering and lying press, science versus pure opinion. And tonight's program, War of the Worlds, is a really wonderful example of how institutions and people of authority rule and manipulate during times of crisis. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to it before tonight, I really do encourage you. It's a wonderful program. And I've been teaching it for about 15 years now. And my students from basically ages 17 to 70, really, so many of them really enjoy it. And not just in a kind of camp, that's fun, old sort of way, but they really find it artistically engaging. So tonight's show was first broadcast, as many of you know, on October 30th, 1938, and was adapted for radio by Orson Welles from H.G. Wells' 1898 novel, The War of the Worlds. And the first question everyone wants to know is usually how many people really panicked when they heard the broadcast that night. And the second question that everybody always wants to know is why did they panic? So in his 1940 book, Invasion from Mars, Princeton professor Hadley Cantrell argued that about 6 million people heard War of the Worlds broadcast. And of that 6 million, about 1 million panicked or were deeply disturbed by what they heard. Now, recent scholarship has really debunked this and said that, look, not that many people panicked, really panicked. Only a few maybe did. And we've had a lot of sort of scholarship to uncover this. W. Joseph Campbell in 2010 argued that basically contemporaneous news coverage was very anecdotal. It was based on sort of wire service roundups that were being blown out of proportion, and newspaper headlines that were again sort of not to be trusted. Brad Schwartz in 2016 did another wonderful book on Orson Welles and fake news, and he also sort of argues that, look, we really don't think that many people panicked, right? It was a sensationalization of what happened, and in this way, it becomes, if you're familiar with the broadcast, right, that it's a fake news event. And so we have a kind of fake news squared here. We have the broadcast itself and then the media coverage of the broadcast, and both of them are not to be trusted. So at this point, we have to ask still, why did some people want to believe, and why is this broadcast so exciting, and why does it still live on today? It's still a very exciting broadcast, and it's still very effective. So why did people still want to believe? So And believe me, there are lots of reasons not to believe, right? It was advertised in the newspaper. The Mercury Theater on the Air was already something that broadcast during this regular time slot. It's a well-known book. Halfway through, he switches from sort of this dramatization to narrative, straight up narrative. And there are also these sort of musical jokes. They play Stardust, La Camparista, which is the little masquerade. And one of the Martian cylinders falls in Morristown, New Jersey, which when the announcer announces it actually sounds like Marstown, New Jersey. So there are lots of reasons not to believe, but many people did, or at least were really excited and thrilled by the broadcast. Now, some people say that what aided the sort of excitement of the broadcast is that people had what was then known as dialitis, right? That you're listening to one show, you get bored with it, you turn to another show. And at that time, the #1 show on the radio was Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, right? I'd love to talk about this at another time, but basically that the #1 show on American radio was A Ventriloquist Act, which my students always love that. They love that fact. And so when we talk about gullibility and the gullibility of people, they say, yeah, back then people were very gullible. Now, if people were listening to that show, what they would have heard if they switched over at certain times. And the idea is that when the music came on during Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, they might have switched over. So there's a musical event during the Charlie McCarthy show that night at about 2:20, 2 minutes, 20 seconds. And that's actually when the War of the Worlds just gets started. And so they wouldn't have heard much. And then another musical event at about 4 minutes, 40 seconds. And if they switched over at that point, they still wouldn't have heard much. In fact, they would have just heard a musical interlude on the War of the Worlds. But then at 15 minutes, 25 seconds, if they switched over from listening to Dorothy Lamour, by the way, if they switched over, they would have heard something a little bit more astounding. And I'll just play just a little bit of that. So again, the theory is they had dialitis, they switched over, and here's what they might have seen, or heard rather.
The most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Wait a minute. Someone's crawling someone or something. I can see turning out of that black hole two luminous discs. The eyes, it might be a face, might be almost but heavens, something wriggling out of the shadow like a gray snake. Now it's another one and another one and another one. They look like tentacles to me. Oh, yeah, I can see the thing's body now. It's large as a bear. It glistens like wet leather, but that face, ladies and gentlemen, it's indescribable. I can hardly force myself to keep looking at it. It's so awful. The eyes are black and they gleam like a serpent. The mouth is kind of V-shaped with saliva dripping from its rimless lips.
I'll pause there. So that's, if those theories are right, that some people tuned in, that might have been what they heard, which could have been disturbing. Now, whenever I ask my students, why do they think that maybe some people believed this was true? You know, from 2005 to about 2016, they usually said, well, they were much more gullible back then, and they didn't have the internet. And I asked them, do they think that could happen today? And they said, no, it couldn't happen today because there's so many different news sources, and we can all fact check and double check and cross check and so on. So it couldn't have happened. And I have to say, in around 2016, their answers began to change a bit. They became more skeptical, and they said, no, I actually can believe that this might happen now. And I would ask them why, and they said, well, because we're more gullible and because of the internet. And so that they have this kind of, like in 2005, there was a greater faith that the internet was going to tell them the truth if they just looked hard enough. And by 2016, they had more of a sense of like, I don't know, there's so much falsehood out there, we don't know, right? And we've seen too many stories where people get sucked into a lie. Anyway, regardless of that, I try to get them to look away from sort of the gullibility of themselves or the gullibility of the past and kind of flip that around and say, okay, instead of thinking about our gullibility, the gullibility of the listener, let's think about the believability of the broadcast. What is it about the broadcast itself that could make it believable? And basically, what I like to do with this, and what I'll do for sort of the rest of the evening, is you start sort of with the outside, the kind of historical context of the broadcast, and move further into sort of the form of the broadcast, and then even further into the studio itself, and look at the certain techniques and sounds, and even especially lack of sound, that made the broadcast believable. So starting with the outside shell here, the historical context. So once again, the broadcast was on the 30th of October, 1938. Now, 1938 was a really important year for invasions in an attempt to unite Germans who found themselves living in different countries after World War I. Hitler began March 12th, 1938, to bring Austria into Germany. So he invaded Austria unopposed, annexed it as part of Germany, then turned to the Sudetenland, then part of Czechoslovakia, where 3 million Germans had been put after World War I. And on a false pretext, he invaded Czechoslovakia and annexed the Sudetenland on September 30th, 1938, a month before the broadcast of War of the Worlds. So listeners were really primed for invasion by the time War of the Worlds came along. And then there's some sort of more natural and local catastrophes where Wells decided to set his version of War of the Worlds, the now famous Grover's Mill, New Jersey. So the Hindenburg disaster, May 6, 1937, at Lakehurst Naval Air Station was 35 miles from Grover's Mill. And then in 1938, there was the Great New England Hurricane, which is sometimes called the Long Island Express, was this most horrific hurricane to hit the area in all the 20th century. Right? That was September 21st, 1938. So disaster and tragedy were also in the air and associated with the region of Grover's Mill and New Jersey in general. But rather than just relocating the setting of the original book from England, which is where Wells originally set it, Orson Welles does more than just sort of recast it in New Jersey. What he does is something much more exciting and groundbreaking. Instead of just making a sort of straight up drama, he turns it into a kind of admonitory example of how radio might work during a national emergency and largely in real time. So he exploited what scholars sometimes call these boundary rituals, the kinds of frames that tell us something is fictional or real. And with radio inherently sort of blurs these boundary rituals between drama and storytelling. Because on stage or in a film, we see someone walking to a store and we can just see them walking to the store. On radio, especially in the early days, before extensive use of sound effects, we might get the sound effect of someone click-clop walking to the store, but then we'll also hear someone saying, so that we know, he's going to the store. And if you listen to a lot of early radio, it's inadvertently humorous the number of times people repeat what they are doing. If you listen to or watch early drama, Shakespeare does this all the time. People say, I am slain, oh, I am slain, and so on, as they die. Now, early radio listeners were by now growing used to these sorts of emergency interruptions, like from the Sudetenland experience or the Hindenburg. So I want us to listen for something from that time. This is H.V. Kaltenborn. He was a broadcaster, and he broadcasts about the Czech crisis over the Sudetenland. And this is, I just want us to listen to this, and then we'll listen to a bit of the War of the Worlds and compare the two, and you'll see right away the similarities here.
Where the meeting will be formally opened. The delay is only very brief. It was to open at 8 o'clock, and it is now almost 15 minutes past. But apparently this demonstration of sympathy for the representatives from Sudeten, Germany, was unexpected. Here they walk up to the platform now. They have been invited, apparently, by Chancellor Hitler to join up with the group of local Berlin party flags, so that the Sudeten colors now will be in line with the swastika banners.
We wish to thank General Mills Incorporated for their courtesy in relinquishing the time for their programs usually heard over some of these stations in order that we may bring you a special broadcast from Berlin. Czechoslovakia rejects Chancellor Hitler's memorandum. The British Parliament is summoned into extraordinary session. President Roosevelt appeals to Chancellor Hitler and President Beneš for peace. With these outstanding developments in the present crisis, the world awaits the address of Germany's leader in Berlin this afternoon. What are Hitler's reactions to these developments? Over its combined networks, coast to coast, the National Broadcasting Company, through the medium of radio, will take you to Berlin as soon as Herr Hitler arrives there. In the meantime, we continue from our Radio City studios in New York.
I'm just going to pause it there. And now I want to play you just a little bit from the War of the Worlds broadcast. And you'll right away notice some similarities here. This is picking up a little bit around where we just stopped listening to War of the Worlds previously. But listen to the form of this, and it will already seem very, very familiar to you. Here we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most terrifying thing I've ever witnessed. Wait a minute. Someone's calling someone or something. I can see turning out of that black hole two luminous discs. The eyes, it might be a face, might be almost... Good heavens, something wriggling out of the shadow like a gray snake. Now it's another one, and another one, and another one. They look like tentacles to me. Oh, yeah, I can see the thing's body now. It's large as a bear. It glistens like wet leather, but that face, ladies and gentlemen, it's indescribable. I can hardly force myself to keep looking at it. It's so awful. The eyes are black and they gleam like a serpent. The mouth is kind of V-shaped with saliva dripping from its rimless lips that seem to quiver and pulsate. And the monster or whatever it is can hardly move. It seems weighed down by possibly gravity or something. The thing's rising up now and the crowd falls back. They've seen plenty. The most extraordinary experience, ladies and gentlemen. I can't find words. Well, I'll pull this microphone with me as I talk. I'll have to stop the description until I can take a new position. Hold on, will you please? I'll be right back in a minute.
We are bringing you an eyewitness account of what's happening on the Wilmoth Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey.
I'll go ahead and pause it there. right? You have the musical interlude, you have the announcer, you have the on-site reporter, right? And so you have this form that the listening audience was very much aware of, and they were growing used to this form. And so hearing that, right, it repeats what they expect to hear during an emergency. Now, it's not only this Wells sort of utilizes, by the way, just the description, I don't have time to talk about it, but that description of the beast is so wonderful. It just hits on every kind of fear and yet doesn't quite gel into anything. It's like a bear, it's leather, it's got tentacles, it's got saliva, it's got a V-shaped mouth, and sort of it's a snake, it's a bear, it's leather, it's slippery. It's really, really amazing. But so Wells is very much aware of this form of emergency radio. And he also, in this broadcast, limits his cast to an all-male cast, who for the most part, represent institutional authority. We have the Columbia Broadcasting System, we have the armed forces, there are politicians, scientists, professors, all of these sort of men of authority who, for the most part, and here we come to the more granular part of my lecture, is sort of looking at the nitty-gritty of what Wells does here. For the most part, all the words and phrases and sentences that they use are fully formed, the Queen's English, wonderfully spoken, articulate, grammatically correct, for the most part. So we want to believe these men of authority. They are, after all, the people who take care of us and who tell us the truth and who keep us safe. And they speak with certainty and assurance in their very masculine voices. However, there are times then when these trustworthy narrators fall apart, and they too become frightened, and they become unprofessional and emotional and involved and overwhelmed by their experiences. But this is also something that radio listeners were getting used to. I mentioned earlier about the Hindenburg disaster. During that disaster, famously, Herbert Morrison, who's a broadcaster, recorded his reactions to it. He was there to cover the landing of the Hindenburg, and then a few minutes into his broadcast, the Hindenburg caught flame completely unexpectedly and burnt to the ground in about 36 or 37 seconds. Just up in smoke immediately. And Morrison breaks down during this moment. And again, I just want to play you some of this. And I'm starting right before he breaks down. So you get a little bit of him being very together, and then you'll hear it.
There are a number of important persons on board, and no doubt the new commander, Captain Max Frisch, is thrilled too, for this is his great moment, the first time he's commanded the Hindenburg, for in previous flights he acted as a chief officer under Captain Lehman. It's practically standing still now. They've dropped ropes out of the nose of the ship, and has been taken a hold of down on the field by a number of men. It's starting to rain again. The rain had slacked up a little bit. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flame. It bursts into flame and it's falling. It's crashing. Watch it, folks. Get out of the way. Get out of the way. Get this started. It's flying and it's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast, and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's place is 20. oh, 400 or 500 feet into the sky. It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around here. I can't even talk to people. His friends are on there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen. Honest, it's just laying there, a massive smoking wreckage, and everybody can't hardly breathe and talk and screaming. Lady, I'm sorry. Honestly, I can hardly breathe. I'm going to step inside where I cannot see it. Charlie, that's terrible. Listen, folks, I'm going to have to stop for a minute because I've lost my voice. This is the worst thing I've ever witnessed.
He's famous, of course, for that line, "Oh, the humanity." Less famous, really, is that those moments when he says, "I can't talk anymore. I have to step inside. I can't see it. I can't talk about it. I can barely breathe." When Wells had Frank Riddick, who was one of his actors, start studying for the part of Carl Phillips, whose voice you've heard a couple of times now. He's the on-site reporter who watches the Martians land. Wells had Frank Riddick study this broadcast by Herbert Morrison. And I want to play a bit now of, again, War of the Worlds. And again, you can hear the similarity in the voices, but I also want you to, for a moment, savor the silences. Savor what isn't said, what isn't heard.
We now return you to Carl Phillips at Grover's Mill.
Ladies and gentlemen, am I on? Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmer's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. More state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain's conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Oh, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object, while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. I can see it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. If those preachers know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. A humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Oh, Lord, they're turning into flames. The whole field's caught by the woods, the cars, the gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill. Evidently, there's some difficulty with our field transmission. However, we will return to that point at the earliest opportunity. In the meantime,
I let it play out for those 5 or 6 seconds of silence. They're extremely uncomfortable. At the beginning of the broadcast, though, he says, there's a wonderful little tiny gem of a moment when he says, "Am I on? Am I on?" And then he goes on as if he knows. And there are all these little tells throughout the broadcast. Somebody at another point says to someone, "Step a little closer to the microphone, a little bit louder," and so on and so forth. And so these little moments of everyday realism, but that moment of silence, and they happen over and over in the broadcast. These are moments of what we call dead air. And here, dead air really means dead. Over and over again, people are silent when they die. The last thing that Phillips says is basically, "It's coming this way, it's 20 yards away." And in that moment, we know he's dead. He's cut off, doesn't even get to finish the sentence. I just want to play you a few more of those moments. I've like I said, I've taught this thing for 15 years or so, and I still get chills. I still find it uncomfortable. I still find it really weird. And my students always sort of say, "Wow, those those moments are really strange," because we are not used to this kind of sonic vacuum on the radio. So, just a few more moments here when we go from everything to nothing, and that nothing means death.
Higher and higher. What? It's standing on legs, actually rearing up on a sort of metal framework. Now it's reaching above the trees and the searchlights are on it. Hold on.
Tripods that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a grave announcement to make. Incredible as it may seem, both the observations of science and the evidence of our eyes.
So the metal tripods rise up, and as soon as they rise up, they die. Here is some artillery.
Lead to the inescapable assumption that those strange feel here. We're informed that the central portion swamp 20 miles south of Marstown.
It's Marstown.
40 yards to the right, sir. There can't see, sir.
Here we have the
coming nearer.
artillery.
Range. 18 feet. Meters. 23 meters. 23 meters. 22. 22. 23.
And then a reporter again dies. By the way, whenever there's time, I love teaching this class with other versions, especially the
Streets are all jammed.
the versions of the early 2000 version by Steven Spielberg of War of the Worlds, and talk about the amount of money that's spent.
Noise in crowds like...
Versus the amount of money spent.
Now the smoke's crossing 6th Avenue. 5th Avenue. 100 yards away. It's 50 feet.
And then finally, the first half of the program ends with this bit of...
Do days exist without arrival of these?
After a brief intermission.
Doc, isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone? 2X, 2L.
That ends basically the first half of the show. I'm happy to talk about the second half as well, but I just want to just talk a few more things here through, and then maybe we can have a bit of a discussion. So the title of the course really comes into play here. We have to use our imaginations during these moments of silence. And that's difficult in this blind medium of radio, where we often need to be guided. We need to be guided when there isn't something visual, without concrete sort of visible objects that extend in space and therefore seem to extend in time. The medium of radio is invisible and evanescent. When something ceases to sound, it therefore ceases to exist. So in radio, all things that are static or silent vanish in performance. And if you don't have anything to say, you vanish. When the sound fills and creates your entire world, then when that sound disappears, your world disappears. There's a wonderful passage from Wallace Stevens' Idea of Order at Key West, a poem where he imagines a woman singing and creating an entire world out of her song. It was her voice that made the sky acutest at its vanishing. She measured to the hour its solitude. She was the single artificer of the world in which she sang. And when she sang, the sea, whatever self it had, became the self that was her song, for she was the maker. Then we, as we beheld her striding there alone, knew that there never was a world for her except the one she sang and singing made. But when the woman's voice is silenced, basically the world ends. And that's what Wells is playing with here. The way that this new medium of radio has the potential to destroy the world, and not with a bang or even a whimper, but just complete silence. And it's not the Martians, really, who are the threat here. They don't destroy the world. It's the medium of radio that does it. I'll have one more little listening here before we finish up. This is the epilogue to the whole piece. Wells comes back on in the character of Orson Welles and takes us out. Here's Wells making his epilogue.
This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen. Out of character, to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. Starting now, we couldn't soap all your windows and steal all your garden gates. By tomorrow night, so we did the best next thing. We annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the CBS. You will be relieved, I hope, to learn that we didn't mean it, and that both institutions are still open for business. So goodbye, everybody, and remember, please, for the next day or so, the terrible lesson you learned tonight. That grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch, and if your doorbell rings and nobody's there, that was no Martian, it's Halloween.
Wells at his best there. So if we believe the epilogue that Wells spins us out here, he intended the War of the Worlds should teach us to beware our own gullibility, particularly with regard to the media. And the show ends with Wells claiming it was all just a joke, but a joke whose punchline has a terrible lesson, he says. And he tells us that grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch. And when he talks about that grinning, glowing, globular invader, he's not just talking about jack-o'-lanterns. He's also talking about radios. Now the numbers, the dials, the diodes of a 1930s radio arranged like a kind of electrified orange face. And I want to, my one visual cue today is this, to kind of bring home the similarity between the radio and the jack-o'-lantern. So replace that radio with the internet, and Wells's injunction still rings true. He anticipated a time when the wars of the worlds would be sort of minute-by-minute experience, and we would have little to defend ourselves from, not just from imaginary invasions, but our own gullibility, as my students like to say, and the gullibility which leads us to tragedy. Thank you so much.